All right, so this is one of those videos where I only have one shot to do it because I only have a certain amount of material to work with. So you're gonna have to bear with me. It's gonna be possibly a little bit rough, but what we're gonna do today is we're gonna go over our white Shou Sugi bond inspired finish. This is by far one of the questions I get asked more than any. And that is, how do we get a vibrant white? Because a lot of times white will end up sort of transparent, it'll end up kind of muddy, and people don't really like that. Now, if you clicked on this video, not really knowing what to expect, what we're doing is what I call a Shou Sugi bond inspired finish. And essentially what we do is we take a piece of lumber like this 2x3 hemlock that I have here, and we burn the face of it with a propane torch. We then take a brush and not only brush the surface char off, we actually dig down with that brush deep enough to get back to the original wood color. And what ends up happening is the grain is blackened and stays that way from the charring process, and then the natural wood color comes back. You end up with a lot of contrast, and then you can go back and you can add a dye or a stain to that and come up with some really pretty results. Of course, today we're working on this white, so you can see the dark hard grain that remains, and then you can see the burnt part sort of tapers down, and where the white has stayed is where the soft spring wood has remained, because we dug that back down all the way back to the raw wood. This is the one I did a couple months ago, and again, we have the black here, and then we have this is the soft spring wood that's in between, and then this is actually a part of that hard grain, but it didn't get burnt. So you end up with this sort of a three-toned effect, but this was done with orange dye. This is one that was done with the white stain. Now, if you want more information on any of this process, I have a playlist of about 9 videos that we've done over the last couple of years that goes over everything, all the way from what type of wood you should be looking for, to how to check for a grain pattern that's going to give you the best result, the burning techniques and some differences between different types of burns. There's actually a lot of detail that goes into some of this stuff. We also go into the brushes. I use a lot of different types of brushes, and I show you what each brush does so you can kind of base it off of that as far as like what kind of finish you want afterwards. I also go into the staining process, what I use for stains and dyes, the coloring, and also the difference between what those colors look like on different burning processes. So again, if you don't know what it is that I'm talking about, I'll list that playlist either up in a card here or at the end of the video or down in the description if I can, and that'll give you all the information that you could possibly need. Now, for those of you that are already caught up with the whole process and have struggled with white, this is going to be the best foolproof system that I can tell you. So what I did to get these pieces is I used the 2x3 and charred the one face with a small propane torch. And then for this, I actually used the Nylox brushes. I started with the 80 grit because that allows you to get down deeper and remove more material at once. And then I moved up to the 120, and then I moved up to the 220. And the 220 is actually going to polish those ridges. And for this is something that can be very beneficial. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that if you have a new set of brushes, or at least not as used as these ones, you're going to end up with different results than what I have here, better results. The 80 grit that I have it's on its last leg. It has been for a while. And so because of that, the bristles are really short. So what happens is when the bristles are nice and long, they're flexible, especially with the 80 grit because it's so aggressive. And say this is the face of the material and we want to brush it going this way. Well, when they're long, they're allowed to flex and they kind of scoop. But when they're shorter, they actually dig in because there's no flex left to them. So hopefully that makes sense. That being said, the 80 grit left a lot of tooling marks left over. So I think if you had a newer brush, or at least one that's not nearly as beat up as this one, your results might look a little bit better than this. Sometimes I notice the little details, you guys might not, but just know that you can get even better than what you see here if you have a brush that's a little bit newer. Now, of course, you can use a wire brush or anything else, but the staining process is going to be different depending on which brush you use. I don't have enough material or time really to go through every single one of those. But again, if you go back and look at those old videos, or those of you guys that already know the process, I think you can kind of put the pieces together and figure out what I'm talking about here. Now, typically when we put a color on, especially in a stain, we put it on, we kind of let it sit for a few minutes to soak in, and then we try and wipe some of it at least back off. And of course, as some of you guys know, depending on how vigorously you wipe, you might end up with a vibrant or less vibrant color left over. So if you wipe off all the stain, then you're left with whatever has penetrated into the wood. With white, it works a little bit different. White almost ends up being transparent, and it's not as vibrant as it is with like a red or a teal or something like that. And so what we want to do is we actually want to leave a lot of stain there. Now I have two pieces here. You guys might be able to see sort of these streaks that run through here. That's because this piece I actually tried to wipe back off. So I took a paper towel similar to this, and this is what I would normally do. I flooded the entire piece using Varathane Antique White. On this one, I left it completely flooded. On this one, I tried to sort of wipe it back down like this. But what happens is you end up taking sort of a pool here and emptying that pool and then dragging it out over these ridges and into other spots and up along the grain. And that's something that we kind of don't want. Again, that works different when you're working with other colors. If you have a bunch of peaks and valleys and you fill those valleys up with liquid and you just dump it on top, the peaks, of course, let everything run down into the valley. So you're pulling up those valleys and you have a little bit that's left over on the top. And that's what we want. We don't want very much on top. White, because white and black are so contrasty, shows up very, very well. And that seems to be a lot of the issue with getting that wiped back off without making sort of a mess of things. Now I let all these sit overnight and fully cure, because then I can come back with steel wool, which is actually kind of the magic to all this, and basically sand those peaks, and it removes that layer of stain that stays on the peaks. It polishes them off, so it kind of scrapes all that top layer off, but it leaves the pooled up stuff in the middle. But that's why you want it to be fully cured, because you're talking about a pool of stain that's in there, and you don't want to really mess with that too much, right? Like I said, when you wipe it out with a paper towel, it's still wet, you're pulling it out of there and dragging it out. So we really need that to stay pooled. So there's a couple things that happens here when we drag. One thing is, you have to remember, we're trying to leave this white that's pulled up. Like if we look at this one here, I have the black here and I have these ridges of white. Okay, so if I was to pull this direction, what I would be doing is I would be scooping into here and pulling that white out. That's not what we want. So we have to pay attention to which direction this grain is going. I'm going to want to turn it this way. That way, when I pull, it's going to skip over those pools for the most part, and it's going to leave this nice white ring that sort of goes along the darkened hardwood. Now I almost forgot, but it's important to mention that there's different kinds of steel wool. I'll try and leave links for all this stuff down below. I know we're not really supposed to be running out to the hardware store right now, but I do typically get this, I believe, at Home Depot. I think it's in the paint department, I believe. I haven't bought it for a while. But steel wool comes in different grades, similar to sandpaper. Here I have a 2/0, it says grade 00, and then I have a 4/0. So I have a 3, I just don't have it here on the table. But this is going to be more coarse. If you think about it in sandpaper terms, this is going to be more coarse. A 4/0 is going to be less coarse. A lot of times I'll grab the 4/0, and that's similar to, let's just say, using like a 220 sandpaper as opposed to an 80 grit sandpaper. Which one's going to remove more material, right? Now, for today, I am going to use the 00 because it is coarser, and I want to show you guys a little quicker how this process actually works. So we are going to use that today. I recommend, because it's very inexpensive, to grab a couple. I leave them up in my sanding cabinet, and then that way I always have them. Steel wool comes in handy for all kinds of stuff, not just this, for finishes and stuff too. So I've already determined which way I want to go. I want to pull this direction as opposed to going against this and actually digging some of this stuff out. Okay, so I have the 00 here, and I'm basically just going to put it on here, and I'm just going to rub. Okay, and I tend to pick it back up, put it back down, and then scrape and sort of do one of these motions. But as you go, hopefully this is all picking up on camera, because if it doesn't, I'm kind of screwed, and so are you guys. you can see, hopefully, that this black is starting to shine up as I'm removing that very top layer. Now, when you get to the end, at this end, of course, when I do this, it's gonna wanna pull that apart. So at this end, carefully, I can kind of come back through here and pull the opposite direction, because I'm only doing it to that end. And again, this is something, like I've said a million times, you guys have to honestly just grab it and experiment with it and see what happens. Okay, now what's really nice about this is I have this knot here. With this knot, I can just take a small piece and I can just come in here and start cleaning that up. And the more I scrub, the more that knot is going to get shined up. You can really take your time with this and get really detailed with it if you want. If you want some of these sort of ridges to come back, you can just wad this up in a little bit narrower form and just hit the centers. I can kind of get down here and get one of these and just drag that center out. And you can also sort of go with the grain as well. So if you kind of come at it at an angle, you're able to get the sides of the peaks as opposed to just the peak itself. You don't want to go too hard or too far, because what used to be black will eventually end up as almost like a brown color. I'm going to get this clean paintbrush here, brush off all the steel wool that got left over, and there we go. Now we have a white. Now that one was wiped off, so I'm going to do the same thing with this one, which was never wiped off. This is just flooded and then put back. Again, I'm using the double aught, and I can just do the same thing here and just polish this until all the blacks come back to a level that I think is satisfactory. And again, if you sort of go diagonal, it'll skip over those valleys even more. And at this point, you can go however aggressive you want with it, depending on the look that you're going for. Now, like I say, I'm ending up with a lot of scratch marks in here. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that my brush is not actually flexing and digging. It's actually tearing into that stuff. So you could use like the 120 and just work at this for a longer time. Again, if you have newer brushes, you're gonna have a lot easier time. But I can come through here. We'll get a new spot on our steel wool. And we'll really sort of work this in. I don't want to take up too much time on this because I'll start losing you guys. But you can see what we're doing. We're just shearing off that top layer that's resting on top up there. And you're leaving, like I said, your guys's can turn out a lot better than mine did. You're leaving these pools, right? We're leaving all this pooled up stuff in here. And that's exactly what I want. Now this honestly is the most foolproof way that I've ever figured out how to do this. It's kind of a pain because you have to do the staining and then let it sit overnight. A lot of times when you're working with other colors that are more forgiving, you can stain and then wipe as much as you want back off and then just let it sit there and dry and you're done. I will say though that the steel wool trick also works with other colors that you really want to be just a tad more vibrant, especially with like a teal color, which is a lot lighter and that tends to rest a little bit more on top. You can use the steel wool trick with those as well and just polish off those tops so that the stain isn't sort of left over, if that makes any sense. Now, of course, if you're doing a different type of brushing technique where you have a lot of wire brush marks, the stain is going to go down. It's going to fill up all those little grooves from where the wires dig in. Try to leave them there as much as you possibly can. Come back with the steel wool. You can do a light wipe down, but again, it's really an experimental thing. You guys just have to get your hands on this stuff and try it out. My favorite thing to do, and I think I've mentioned this before, is just go down to the lumber yard, grab a stick, look for a decent grain pattern that you can cut up into a bunch of different pieces, which is exactly what I have here. Or those of you that have, shops or something where you have this stuff already in the shop, take and cut up a bunch of 6 or so inch long pieces and try this out. If you have more tools and you can resaw these and get kind of a 2-for-1 deal, do that and experiment with this stuff. This is really the only way that you're gonna figure out what works best. But I'm telling you, flood it, let it sit. You can wipe down a little bit if you want, but use that steel wool. That steel wool is gonna be your best friend. So hopefully this gives you guys enough information to at least sort of get started or kind of know where you might have went wrong before. White is very difficult. It's just the way it goes. And like I said, for those of you that want to know more about this process, make sure you check out those other videos. There is a ton of information in there going over every little detail you could possibly want. That's it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video as always. We'll see you guys in the next one.